The shocking truth why ground effect skirts were banned from F1. In 1977, Mario Andretti climbed into a Lotus 78 and felt something no Formula One driver had ever experienced before. The car didn't simply grip the circuit. It seemed to pull itself downward onto the surface. Corners that would have felt suicidal the previous year suddenly seemed almost effortless. The machine felt glued to the asphalt in a way racing had never seen. The secret was surprisingly simple. Two flexible rubber strips running along the bottom edges of the car. They were called skirts. Within just 5 years, these simple pieces of rubber would transform Formula One into the fastest and most dangerous period the sport had ever witnessed. And just as quickly, they would be banned forever after a string of frightening accidents that unsettled even the toughest drivers in the paddock. This is the story of ground effect, sliding skirts, and the short, brilliant, and deadly moment when engineers realized they could bend aerodynamics itself. Along the way, there are visionary designers, terrified drivers, exploding machinery, and a technology so risky that Formula One eventually had to eliminate it before it eliminated everyone else. But first, how did racing reach this point? What did Formula One aerodynamics look like before someone realized the entire car could become a giant suction device? To understand why sliding skirts were revolutionary, you first have to understand what came before them. And honestly, the early history of downforce in Formula One is almost a comedy of mistakes. For the first couple of decades of Grand Prix racing, hardly anyone thought seriously about aerodynamics. Race cars were shaped like cigars simply because that seemed streamlined enough. The idea was straightforward. Make the car slippery so it goes fast on the straights, and let the tires handle the corners. If drivers needed more grip, teams fitted stickier tires or adjusted the suspension. That was basically the entire strategy. Then, in the late 1960s, someone had a radical thought. Instead of only trying to reduce drag, why not use the air to push the car downward? The idea was simple: wings, like those on an airplane, but flipped upside down. An airplane wing creates lift because low pressure forms above the wing while higher pressure forms underneath. Turn that concept upside down and mount it to a race car, and suddenly the air pushes the vehicle toward the ground instead of lifting it. Downforce had arrived. The first wings appeared in 1968, and they looked completely absurd. Massive airplane-style wings were mounted on tall struts directly connected to the suspension. It looked as if someone had glued model airplane parts onto a racing machine. But there was one important detail. They worked. Cars suddenly blasted through corners faster than anyone believed possible. Unfortunately, there was a serious flaw. Because the wings were bolted directly to the suspension, all that extra force was going into parts that had never been designed to carry it. At the 1969 Spanish Grand Prix, both Lotus cars suffered catastrophic wing failures. The structures snapped at high speed. Jock and Rince's car lifted off the ground. Graham Hill's machine did the same. Both drivers were incredibly lucky to survive. The FIA, the governing body of the sport, reacted immediately. Tall-mounted wings were banned. From that point forward, wings had to be attached to the body of the car and were restricted in both size and placement. That decision made sense, but it also created a challenge. With wings limited, engineers began searching for other ways to produce downforce. And that search led to a breakthrough. Eventually, someone asked a fascinating question. What if the entire car could function as a wing? The man who answered that question was Colin Chapman, founder of Lotus and one of the most brilliant and controversial figures in racing history. Chapman wasn't satisfied with simply winning races. He wanted to win them in ways nobody had imagined before. He was famous for pushing the limits of the rulebook, spotting loopholes others missed, and designing cars that were either revolutionary masterpieces or spectacular disasters, sometimes both. Chapman began looking at aerodynamics from a different angle. While most teams obsessed over wings and spoilers mounted on top of the car, he looked underneath. The underside of a Formula One car was essentially a flat surface, hovering only inches above the track. Chapman wondered, what if that surface could generate downforce? The principle behind this idea is known as ground effect. Here's how it works. If the underside of the car is shaped properly, forming a tunnel that narrows and then expands, the air flowing beneath the vehicle accelerates. Faster air means lower pressure. With lower pressure under the car and normal pressure above it, the atmosphere itself pushes the car toward the ground. In effect, the car becomes a giant suction device. But there was a catch. For the system to work, the edges of the car had to be sealed. If high-pressure air from the sides leaked underneath, the low-pressure zone would disappear, and the effect would collapse. The solution was sliding skirts. The Lotus 78, introduced in 1977, became the first true ground-effect Formula One car. The side pods were shaped like inverted wings, forming tunnels underneath the vehicle. Along the lower edges of these pods were flexible skirts made from rubberized material. They slid vertically along rails so they could maintain contact with the track even as the car bounced and rolled through corners. These skirts sealed the underside of the car and preserved the low-pressure area that produced massive downforce. The results were immediate and astonishing. Mario Andretti described the feeling as completely different from anything he had experienced. The car no longer felt as if it was held up by tires. Instead, it felt as if invisible forces were pulling it toward the pavement. Cornering speeds increased dramatically. The Lotus 78 won 5 races during 1977, but that was only the beginning. Chapman already knew the concept could go much further. The real weapon arrived the following season. The Lotus 79, introduced in 1978, represented ground effect perfected. Engineers refined the Venturi tunnels, improved the skirts, and designed the entire car around, using the floor to generate downforce. The wings were almost secondary. The result was domination. Andretti won 6 races and secured the World Championship. His teammate, Ronnie Peterson, added 2 more victories. Other teams were stunned and immediately began studying the design. What they discovered was both simple and frightening. The skirts were the key. Without them, the system lost its seal, and most of the downforce disappeared. But, with the seal intact, the car produced downforce levels that had previously seemed impossible. Some estimates even suggested that at high enough speeds, the Lotus 79 could theoretically drive upside down on a ceiling. Naturally, every team began copying the concept. Williams, Brabham, Ferrari, everyone rushed to build their own ground effect machines. By 1979 and 1980, nearly the entire grid used sliding skirts. And that's when the real problems began. The incredible downforce numbers came with a hidden danger. The system was extremely sensitive to ride height. If the car rose even slightly, perhaps hitting a bump or momentarily losing skirt contact with the road, it could instantly lose a massive amount of downforce. Imagine cornering at 150 miles per hour. Your car has enough aerodynamic grip to hold that speed through the turn. Suddenly, the skirt lifts for just an instant. The seal breaks. In a fraction of a second, you lose half your grip. The car that felt glued to the track suddenly begins sliding, and at 150 miles per hour, sliding usually means crashing. Drivers began calling it the ground effect lottery. You could drive a perfect lap, do everything right, and still lose control because of a bump, a worn skirt, or debris on the track. Unlike ordinary loss of grip, which happens gradually and allows time to react, this happened instantly. One moment, you had control. The next moment, you were just a passenger. Crashes became terrifying. Cars slammed into barriers at speeds unimaginable just a few years earlier. The most unbelievable part was that the engineers knew about the danger. The drivers certainly did. Yet instead of backing off, teams pushed the concept even further. Skirts became longer and stiffer. Some teams used ceramic materials that could survive constant grinding against the asphalt. Others developed hydraulic systems designed to push the skirts downward even harder. The goal was simple: maintain the seal at all costs. The FIA attempted to intervene. In 1981, officials introduced a rule requiring a minimum ride height of 6 centimeters. The hope was that keeping the cars farther from the ground would reduce the extreme ground effect forces. The teams immediately found ways around the rule. They created suspension systems that compressed at high speed, lowering the car far below the legal limit once it was moving. Ride height was only checked in the pits while the car was stationary. During the race, the cars effectively ran much lower. One of the most infamous solutions came from Brabham designer Gordon Murray. He created a hydraulic suspension system that allowed the driver to pump a lever in the cockpit and lower the car after leaving the pits. The car passed inspection legally, then it dropped to an illegal height once the race began. Before returning to the pits, the driver raised it again. Everyone knew it was cheating, but proving it was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, driving these machines became brutal. To maintain consistent downforce, the suspension had to be incredibly stiff. Soft suspension allowed the car to move too much, which could break the seal. So teams made the suspension rock hard, virtually no movement at all. Drivers felt every bump directly through their bodies. Keke Rosberg, the 1982 world champion, later described driving those cars as physical torture. Vibrations were so intense that drivers struggled to see clearly because their eyeballs literally shook in their sockets. Many developed long-term back injuries. Some suffered kidney problems from the constant pounding. Drivers could lose several pounds of body weight during a single race. And all of this happened while knowing that at any moment the car could suddenly lose its grip and throw them into a wall at 150 miles per hour. The 1982 season became the breaking point. It was one of the most tragic seasons in Formula One history. Gilles Villeneuve died during qualifying at the Belgian Grand Prix after his Ferrari launched into a violent series of somersaults.